Montana Territory, 1884. The wind came down off the crazy mountains, sharp and cold, rattling the bare cottonwoods and whistling through the chinks in the barn walls as if it had a voice of its own. It was the kind of morning that made a woman wonder what else life might take from her. Grace Nolan stood in her long coat and boots, arms wrapped tight around her chest as she stared at the wagon tracks cutting away from the house. Her husband had left 3 days ago. No goodbye, no note, just gone, taking their last good horse and his pride with him. Left her with 2 hungry children, a half-rotten barn, and a ranch one dry season from ruin. Inside the house, 5-year-old Nora was coughing again. Grace winced and stepped back through the door, where 9-year-old Nathan sat cross-legged near the stove, feeding in bits of kindling like it was the only thing keeping the world upright. "Ma," he said softly, without looking up. "We're out of flour." She nodded. "I know. They had no more credit in town. No animals to butcher. And the cows had stopped calving weeks ago." Grace's hands were raw from chopping wood, milking what was left of their thin-boned cows, trying to hold the place together. But it was slipping through her fingers. That night, just after the moon crested the ridge, Grace wrapped Nora in a blanket and lifted her into the wagon. Nathan climbed in beside her, quiet and wide-eyed. Grace took the reins with shaking hands and drove them west, toward the only name she could think of, Harlan Sutton. She had not seen him in nearly 10 years. He had been a boy with a broken front tooth and a quiet laugh back then, working alongside her brother on cattle drives, always bringing her wildflowers and pretending it was not a big thing. She had married someone else. So had he once. But his wife had passed 2 winters back. She remembered that much. His ranch, they said, was failing. But Harlan himself? Folks still said he was the kind of man who would not let a child go cold if he had a coat on his back. The ride took the better part of a day and a night. The snow came down in flurries by morning, and Grace could feel Nora's fever burning hotter. She pushed the horses harder. By the time the house came into view, her fingers were blue and her lips cracked. The ranch was smaller than she remembered. Fences sagged. A shed had collapsed under snow. But smoke curled from the chimney and the light in the window was steady. Grace barely managed to bring the wagon to a stop before Harlan came out onto the porch, a rifle in one hand. His eyes narrowed, then widened as he recognized her. "Grace," he said, stepping down into the snow. "What? She's sick," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I did not know where else to go." He was at the wagon in 2 strides. He reached in, lifted Nora as if she weighed nothing, and turned toward the house. "Get inside. Both of you." The fire was already going strong. Harlan laid Nora down on the cot near the stove, then turned to Nathan and knelt. "You hurt?" Nathan shook his head. "Just hungry." Harlan turned to Grace. "Sit. I will get food." The stew was thin but hot. Grace held the tin bowl with both hands, shaking as she ate. Nora stirred once, let out a weak cry, and Harlan was there with a damp cloth and water. He did not ask questions. Not that night. When morning came and the wind had calmed, Grace found him outside splitting logs. His shirt sleeves were rolled, breath fogging the air. He looked tired. Older. But still steady. "I know this is not your problem," she said, standing near the door. "I will find work. I can help with the ranch. Anything. I will not just take." He lowered the axe. "You are not taking. You are surviving." Grace blinked hard. "We will not stay long." He looked over at her then, eyes meeting hers. "You will stay as long as you need." She nodded, biting her lip. Over the next week, Grace worked harder than she ever had. She mended fences, chopped wood, helped Harlan feed the cattle. Nathan worked beside him, learning fast. Nora's fever broke, and the color came back to her cheeks. Every evening they ate together. Harlan never spoke much, but when he did, it was kind, steady. Grace found herself watching his hands, the way he always poured milk into her cup first, the way he waited until the children were asleep before taking time to rest. One morning, She caught him watching her as she braided Nora's hair. He looked away fast, but her heart beat differently after that. 2 weeks in, the first snowstorm hit hard. The wind howled, and the snow came fast enough to bury the fence posts. Harlan moved the whole family into the main house, close to the fire. That night, as they sat near the hearth, Grace leaned back against the wall and exhaled. "I do not know how we would have made it without you." He looked at her, quiet. "I mean it," she said softly. "You saved us." He stared at the fire for a long moment. Then his voice came low, rough. "I did not think I had anything left worth saving." Grace blinked, caught off guard. "You do. You do." Harlan met her eyes, and something shifted between them. Not fast, not loud, but clear. She smiled. He looked like he had not seen a smile in years. And in that moment, it was no longer about survival. It was something else. Something warmer. Something beginning. The wind quieted just after dawn, laying a hush over the land thick enough to hear the ice shift on the eaves. In the stillness, Harlan stood at the edge of the barn, one hand on the doorframe, watching the white blanketed hills beyond his property line. The snow had buried most of the fence rails on the north slope. Somewhere beneath, a steer groaned low, muffled. He stepped out, boots crunching through the drift, and found Grace already hauling water from the well, her sleeves soaked to the elbow. "You should have waited," he said. "It's hard pulling that crank when the rope freezes." She straightened, breath fogging the air. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I might as well be useful." "She's warm enough in the house?" Grace nodded. "Nathan's sitting up with her. Her breathing's clearer this morning." He reached for the bucket handle without a word and carried it back toward the porch. She followed him in silence, her footsteps light behind him. Inside, Nora lay curled beneath 3 quilts, her cheeks flushed but no longer hollow. Nathan dozed beside her, his hand resting on her back like he meant to keep her anchored there. Grace pulled the wool shawl tight around her shoulders. "He's got the same stillness in him you do. Doesn't say much, but he notices everything." Harlan rubbed his palms over the stove's front plate. "That boy's been asked to grow up too fast. There wasn't time for anything else." He looked at her then, face drawn but steady. "You're not the only one who's been holding too much." She didn't answer, just moved to the table and began slicing what was left of a dried apple cake from days before. He watched her hands, the way she cupped the knife so the pieces came out clean, even with the crust stiff from cold. "I kept the ledger from last spring," she said. "If I can read through it, I might see where your costs ran high." His brow lifted. "You know ranch books? My father did them by hand. I used to copy them line for line till I could do it blind. My husband wasn't one for numbers." He pulled out the drawer where the ledger lay, pages stiff with dust. "You're welcome to it. I stopped tracking feed costs once the herd started thinning." She took it from him, flipped through the first few pages, and frowned. "You're over-ordering salt blocks. Twice what the herd needs, even in winter." He blinked. "I thought they went faster than usual." "They're getting buried under snow. You've probably got 3 still out there, hard as stone." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Guess I stopped seeing what wasn't right in front of me. Grief does that." He looked up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something in his expression cracked open. "I still hear her," he said. "Sometimes I think she's just in the next room. That if I wait long enough, the floorboards will creak and she'll come walking in." Grace held his gaze. "I used to dream mine still had his boots by the door. Kept waking up to put them out every morning, even after I knew better." He didn't flinch. "He left you in a hard spot." He left because he didn't know how to stay. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The stove ticked, expanding in the heat. Later that afternoon, when the sun cut through the gray enough to soften the light, they walked the fence line together. Grace carried a sack of feed, Harlan a mallet and nails for the splintered rails. The snow reached her knees in the lower pasture, but she kept pace with him, eyes sharp. "You've got a low spot in the west corner," she said, pointing with her chin. "Water's pooling there under the snow. Come thaw, you'll lose the post. I'll need to dig a channel. I can start it once the ground softens." She hesitated. "I could help break it up." "You've done enough already." "I'd do more," she said, voice low but certain. If you'd let me. He stopped walking. The clouds shifted, casting a pale light across the field. Her breath rose between them and she didn't look away. I've been so used to holding it all myself, he said finally. I forgot what it felt like to have someone stand beside me and mean it. She stepped closer, just enough that her sleeve brushed his. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. He looked down at her, a long look, measured and quiet. Then he reached out and touched her wrist, not a grasp, just the weight of trust settling into place. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things not yet said, of mornings not yet lived, of a life that might still be built from what remained. As they turned back toward the house, side by side now, the wind shifted again. But this time it was softer. Almost warm. The thaw came slowly, peeling winter back in streaks of brown and green. By March, the snow along the south-facing slope had melted down to muddy patches, and the creek behind the barn began to move again, sluggish but certain. The days grew longer, and with them came a rhythm uneven, but theirs. Grace worked the kitchen garden beside the porch, turning the soil with her sleeves rolled high and her braid tucked under a kerchief. The seed sacks she'd brought from her old home hadn't been enough, but Harlan had found a few more in a chest in the smokehouse. Sorghum, turnip, and beans still good under the dust. One morning, as she pushed her hands into the earth, Nathan came running from the slope behind the barn, cheeks flushed, boots damp. There's a cow dropped her calf, he said. Harlan sent me to fetch the rope sling. Grace stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. Where is she? In the draw, near the cottonwoods. He's with her. She didn't hesitate. The sling was already hanging beside the stable door. She grabbed it, threw on her coat, and hurried after Nathan across the yard and through the thinning snowdrifts. She found Harlan crouched beside the mother cow, one hand on her flank, the other steadying the calf's head. The newborn was half out, slick with afterbirth, its legs tangled. She's straining wrong, Grace said, kneeling beside him. We need to turn it. Harlan gave a curt nod. I tried, but she tensed too fast. Let me. He shifted to make room, pressing his shoulder against the cow's side so she wouldn't roll. Grace reached in with practiced care, jaw tight with focus. She found the foreleg, guided it free, then the second. The cow groaned low, and the calf slid out into the cold grass. It didn't move. Harlan pulled off his gloves and dropped to his knees, rubbing the calf's ribs hard. Grace took over the mouth, clearing mucus, then rubbed briskly along the spine with her shawl. Come on, she whispered. Come on now. The calf coughed, then let out a thin, startled bleat. Harlan sat back on his heels, breathing hard. You've done that before. Grace looked up. I was there for 4 births last spring. Only one made it. He nodded, eyes on the calf as it wobbled against its mother's side. This one has a shot. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. We'll need to check them both again at dusk. He rose too, slower, and watched her a long moment. You didn't flinch. No reason to. That's not nothing, he said. She met his gaze and held it. You asked me to stay. I'm staying. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to embers, Grace sat at the table sewing a patch into Harlan's sleeve. The fabric had torn near the elbow, hauling fence rails. He came in from the barn, snowmelt dripping from his cuffs. She's feeding the calf now. Took to it quick. That's good. He poured water from the kettle, then sat across from her. The only sound was the thread pulling through fabric. I've been thinking, he said. The east pasture, if we clear the brush, fence it proper, we could graze more come summer. She didn't look up. That'd mean more mouths to feed through next winter. I know, but it might bring in enough to stop leaning on the rail company. She tied off the stitch and set the shirt aside. You're not just patching things anymore. You're building again. He studied her face in the lamplight, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. You've got a way of seeing what I don't. You've got a way of holding steady when everything's coming apart. He blinked. Didn't expect to hear that from you. I didn't expect to feel safe again, she said softly. But I do. The quiet stretched out between them, not awkward, just full of something new. He reached across the table, rough fingers brushing hers. I don't know what this is becoming, but I can't picture the days without you in them now. She turned her hand under his, letting their palms rest together. Then don't. Outside, the wind had stilled. No wood creaked. No frost snapped. Just the soft hush of warmth growing in the hollows winter left behind. The rains came in April, soft and steady, soaking into the split earth until the pasture grasses stirred awake. Green rose through the thaw like something half-remembered, and the smell of wet soil lingered through the mornings. Grace stood beneath the porch eave, watching Nathan lead the two youngest heifers toward the lower gate. He'd grown taller, shoulders squaring out beneath the coat Harlan had let out for him. He moved with a quiet confidence now, glancing back only once before disappearing down the slope. Harlan stepped out beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. His shirt was damp beneath the arms and his hair curled slightly from the sweat of mending tack inside the barn. You think he's ready for the branding run next week? He asked. Grace leaned against the post. He doesn't need to be ready. He just needs to try. He'll do more than that. She turned toward him. You ever wish you'd had a boy to raise? He folded the rag, slow and neat. I used to think about it. Had names picked out once. But by the time the years passed and none came, I stopped looking for what wasn't there. Grace nodded, fingers brushing the wood grain. I used to imagine a long table, big enough for a dozen plates, all of them full. You were meant to have more, he said. I thought I had everything I needed, until it was gone. She didn't say it for pity. He didn't take it as such. The table's not empty now, he said after a pause. Not by a long stretch. The rain picked up again, a light tapping on the tin roof. It made the silence between them feel fuller, not lacking. That night, Nora fell asleep curled with a rag doll Grace had stitched from scrap linen, her hair fanned over the pillow in damp waves. Harlan watched her from the doorway, then turned toward the kitchen, where Grace was boiling water for tea. She's been sleeping deeper, he said. Grace poured the water carefully. I think she finally believes this place won't slip away. He leaned against the doorframe. Neither will you. She didn't answer right away. Then, you never asked why I stayed as long as I did. Before. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. She set the kettle aside. My husband wasn't cruel, but he was always somewhere else in his mind. Farming ideas that never rooted. Even when he was home, I felt alone. I know that kind of quiet, Harlan said. The kind that doesn't leave room for your own voice. I stopped hearing mine for a long time. He stepped into the room, took one of the tin cups from her hand, careful not to brush her fingers. You've got it back now. She gave a soft laugh, not bitter. Some days I still reach for silence like it's safer. I won't let it take you again. The lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the wear around his eyes. She wondered how long he'd carried his own silences, how much he'd never said because no one had asked. She looked at him and saw not just the man who had taken her in, but the man who had stayed standing when everything else fell apart. You fixed the collar on Nathan's coat without saying a word, she said. You didn't want him to feel like he lacked. It wasn't about pride. It was about care. He looked at her then in a way that left no space between them, even though they hadn't moved. You see too much. I see what's true. The kettle hissed behind them, but neither turned. She set her cup down, stepped forward. The space between them had already been closing for weeks, in shared labor, in the way they listened instead of filling the air. When she reached for him, it wasn't sudden. It was natural. Like reaching for the sun after a long gray season. His hands came to her waist, steady and warm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the stillness, they breathed the same air. The fire crackled low. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted in its stall. Neither of them had been given easy beginnings. But in that moment, they chose the middle. Together. And when his lips touched hers, it wasn't a question. It was a promise. Earned. Quiet. Unshakable. By late May, the soil was warm enough to plant. Grace rose just after first light, tying her apron over her dress and stepping barefoot into the tilled rows behind the barn. The dew soaked her hem and the earth pressed cool against her soles. She moved slowly, pressing seeds into the furrows with her thumb, covering them with a sweep of her palm. She didn't rush. The quiet work steadied her. Nathan was in the upper pasture with Harlan, checking the new fence line that ran along the ridge. Nora sat on the porch with a tin cup of milk and a rag doll tucked beneath her arm, watching the meadowlarks flit over the grass. She'd begun humming again, tuneless but content. Grace finished the row and stood, stretching her back. She turned toward the house and saw Harlan coming down the slope, his hat pushed back, sleeves rolled, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. He looked different in the light, more at ease, though the lines around his eyes were still carved deep. "There's a pair of strays near the north markers," he said as he reached her. "We'll have to drive them back down this evening." She brushed dirt from her hands. "I'll help." He glanced at the neat lines of seedlings behind her. "You've done more than enough for one morning. I like knowing things are growing again." He looked down at her hands, soil still under her nails. "You ever think of planting something for yourself?" "I am." He stepped closer, the rope slipping from his shoulder, landing soft beside them. "I was thinking when the branding's over and the herd's settled we could ride into town. There's a man there cuts wedding bands from silver coin." Grace blinked, breath caught for a moment. "You're asking me. I'm not much for speeches, but I know what I want, and I know what you've given me." She reached up, touched the edge of his collar. "I'd marry you in a field with nothing but the sky above us." "You'd have both," he said. "Sky and silver." She smiled, leaning into him. "Then yes." The days that followed moved with intention. Grace taught Nora to string beans along twine and showed Nathan how to boil potatoes without burning the bottom of the pot. Harlan worked the herd with steadiness, letting Nathan take the lead more often. They made space for each other, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something chosen. When they rode into town, Grace wore her mother's shawl, the one she'd kept wrapped in oilcloth since the day she left her old home. Harlan wore a clean shirt, and Nathan rode just behind them, Nora in front of him, her arms around his waist. The blacksmith's wife met them at the church steps, her hands full of wildflowers. The ceremony was quiet. Just the minister, the children, and the faint sound of wind rattling the cottonwoods outside. Grace held Harlan's hand, the silver band still warm, and felt the steadiness of his breath as he said her name. Afterward, they didn't linger. They rode back before dusk, the wagon creaking under the weight of supplies and a new kettle. Harlan reached for Grace's hand as they crossed the last ridge, fingers twining without a word. That night, she unpacked their few wedding gifts, a length of blue calico, a jar of preserved peaches, a small wooden comb carved with a pine tree. She tucked them into the corner cabinet beside their plates. When the stars rose, they sat on the porch with the children asleep behind them and the scent of lilacs on the air. The lantern burned low. Harlan reached for her hand again, thumb brushing her knuckles. "I used to think peace was something that came when everything else stopped," he said. "Now I know it's something you build." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "We built it." He turned his face toward hers, quiet and certain. "And we'll keep building. Every day." She nodded. "Every day." The moon slid higher. The cattle lowed in the distance. And inside the house, the fire burned steady, warm, and waiting. They had known loss. They had known silence. But now they knew something else, something lasting. They knew home. Years passed. The garden widened, stretching past the shed. The herd grew strong again. Nathan took to the far fields with quiet skill, and Nora learned to read by the fire, her voice soft but sure. Grace and Harlan never stopped working, never stopped choosing each other in every shared task, every touch passed in the doorway. They grew old in the same house, the porch creaking beneath their chairs, the sky above them just as wide as the day they first found each other again. And their table, though never crowded, was always full.